Over the past year, indie horror has slowly started to form a very negative reputation and is now known as a repetitive, unoriginal, and decaying genre that only serves as a punching bag to make fun of these, admittedly, poorly made games. Obviously, the indie horror genre has changed over the years with new trends, gameplay styles, and so on. I'm not denying that. Although, I am denying the fact that the indie horror genre is quote-unquote dying. I mean, the genre feels like it's been more alive than it's ever been, either for better or for worse, depending on how you perceive the quality of these games. Me personally, I can agree that games like Garten of BanBan or the recent Spectator have not been very good titles, whether that be due to the disgustingly blatant plagiarism, unoriginality, or prosaic story writing, or just downright tedious or atrocious gameplay. The indie horror genre has made it exceptionally easy for games made by small development teams or one-person developers to hit it big, and that's a great thing. For example, the game Friday Night Funkin', which everyone and their pet morsel of leftover shrimp has heard about, was a small indie title that was made by like 4 people submitted to a game jam. FNF went on to be the most successful game of the time, garnering an insane amount of traction, and then modding came around, and since the popularization and blow up of mods, this game has quite literally made people's careers just from making mods for a video game. My point is, anybody with at least simple coding knowledge and some level of artistic talent can make a popular indie horror title. Games like Spectator, Garten of BanBan, and Poppy Playtime reached extreme popularity due to their similarities, those being the analog VHS themes, the horror aspects revolving around the death of children or something, and just the general horror aspects were all similar in their own ways. Spectator is an extremely buggy mess when it comes to gameplay. Everything is sloppily designed and the whole thing just feels messy. But the biggest flaw that stands out with this game is that it, as many people have said, copies every aspect from every popular indie horror game, taking from the Backrooms, Five Nights at Freddy's, because of course, Poppy Playtime, and even Slenderman of all things. This is by far the most unoriginal horror game I've ever laid eyes on. Nothing about this game is original, even down to its gameplay mechanics, which were copied from a game series called I'm on Observation Duty, in which you control cameras to capture any potential paranormal behavior. The worst part, worse than all of these critiques being thrown against the game, is that this game is being sold for $13. $13 for this game. If that doesn't scream scam, then I will. Scam! So, knowing all that, it's safe to assume that Spectator is definitely the most unoriginal indie horror game published, but I think the game knows what it's doing. It knows that it's obviously extremely unoriginal.
Post-editing Demon here. So I was looking at the Steam description for Spectator, and I came upon the realization that it specifically said in the description featuring Backrooms, Slender, Faz Pizza, and many more locations based on creepy stories. So, with that being said, and now that I think about it, they literally have Slenderman in the little banner thing. So now that I think about it, calling this like a ripoff might be a little bit unfair. So I think calling it a ripoff or unoriginal is in a way unfair because, I mean, it, like I said, it knows that it's doing that. So that criticism might be a little bit less valid now, seeing that. But it's definitely illegal.
Knows what it's doing. It knows that it's obviously extremely unoriginal and takes aspects from every indie game that's ever existed. I believe that what this game was trying to do was combine all of these commonly used themes from indie horror and compile them into one big game. And I think that, in some ways, is really cool. I like to see this game as an attempt to create something like that, and I'm all for it. At least I'd like to see it like that. But this game was undeniably made in bad taste. They had an idea, and honestly, a great one at that. A game that could combine gameplay aspects from Five Nights at Freddy's, visual and horror aspects from Poppy Playtime or the Backrooms, characters similar to really cool if done correctly, but the execution here is atrocious. The game is filled with bugs and horrible optimization and was even theorized to be a crypto miner, which is the working theory as of now. Overall, the game had a lot of potential to be something really cool, but it was made by scumbags who were clearly trying to make a profit off of indie horror. And honestly, I don't know if I want to even consider this an indie horror game. This feels too far off from any indie horror game I've played. No, this isn't an indie horror game. This is just a really bad attempt at marketing off of the indie horror genre. genre. Garten of BanBan, on the other hand, well, I don't really know where to begin. Garten of BanBan, at least to me, is a genuinely unbearable game to watch or play. It's very bare bones and boring, and while it has a few as in one creepy moment scare that got me, it doesn't make up for the lackluster amount of gameplay or story. But I don't think that the game was made to be good, nor do I think it was made to be serious. The Euphoric brothers, who are the masterminds behind Garten of BanBan, have shown that they are very capable of creating genuinely interesting and cool games, and compared to Garten of BanBan, these are all much higher quality in terms of gameplay and quality. Unlike Spectator, which was an attempt at making a shit ton of money off of popular indie horror games, the Garten of BanBan development team, who was literally just two dudes making games, did it for fun. The game is free, so it isn't like they're making too much money off of the game, and it's clear it was made as a joke, or even a critique on the current state of indie games. A lot of the hatred that was thrown at Garten of BanBan definitely felt somewhat unjustified, considering the game was taken far too seriously than was intended. Criticizing the game is valid, of course, despite it being a satire game, it still feels unplayable, and if just a little bit more effort went into creating this game, it probably would have received more positive feedback. But once again, I'm sure this low quality, unplayable feel is very much intentional, to give the full, authentic, shitty indie horror game in 2023 feel. And I have to respect the dedication. There's a fine line between a game that was made to market off indie horror and an obvious scam, and a game that was made by two guys to joke about indie horror. And this is where a lot of people are getting the message misconstrued. I've seen so many commentary channels similar to mine that have talked about how the indie horror genre is dying, and most of their claims have simply been based on these three games: Poppy Playtime, Garten of BanBan, and Spectator. I hate to break it to you, but a community or a genre won't die because of a couple shitty games that happen to blow up. The indie horror genre is, to this day, still filled to the brim with fun, high-quality games that actually do a good job at making you interested or scared. I think it's actually insane that this is something that is even being said, considering the dozens of indie horror games that have actual effort and original ideas put into them and are being put out there for free. I say with 100% certainty that there are twice the amount of quality games than there are Spectators, Garten of BanBans, and Poppy Playtimes. And this pessimistic view on the indie horror genre feels almost forced, because I genuinely feel like these creators making these videos on why indie horror is dying or the worst of indie horror are doing so because people like negative content and like watching people break down the flaws of a game genre or a community, myself included. I can't deny that I do watch creators like Plain Trace or Dags. I like watching people break down why something is bad. It's fun, but a situation like this feels forced. I don't know, I just have a hard time believing that even my favorite horror commentary channels are spreading this falsity, and I have a hard time believing that they actually mean it. Ever since Civilization, we've been constantly, purposefully brewing up controversy or negativity because it gets the most attention, and in this current day situation, especially on the internet, and even so more on the news, negativity and controversy thrive more than anything. To show what I mean, here are some takes by horror commentary channels that represent the feeling of this forced negativity.
Garten of BanBan represents everything that's currently wrong with the mascot horror market. Poppy Playtime was the writing on the wall for what was to come, and this game is what came, as it's a very bland, dull, and boring game throughout. People used to clown on the games that weren't even functional, but it's gotten to the point where they are functional now. They just have no spirit going on. It feels like a cheap grab for attention and money. I like this genre and the communities that came from this side of gaming and the internet in general. It's always held this small little place in my heart despite my taste mainly being in first-person shooters. But at times like this, when looking at the current iteration of how things are going, I can't help but have this weird depressing feeling like it's the beginning of the end.
It's pathetic how bad they usually are. Like Poppy Playtime, that one was doable, but FNAF Security Breach, that was trash. Project Playtime, that was just a rip-off of Dead by Daylight. You have Bendy and the Ink Machine, like the new one. I've heard that one was pretty like okay, but I can't be bothered to play it, you know? Like all of them are just so laser focused on being super kid friendly. Like the goal of them is to make like all these let's player make like these extremely over exaggerated videos where they like quote unquote get spooked from jump scares that aren't even that like scary to begin with. And all of them have the exact same like location. You go to an abandoned factory or an abandoned like pizzaplex or an abandoned like kindergarten, and at that location they did a bunch of wacky experiments with kids, and now there are a bunch of monsters that are roaming around with kid spirits in them. Ooh, like FNAF did it like 8 years ago, and it's still just being repeated over and over and over again, but instead of it being animatronics, it's a toy. Instead of it being a toy, it's like a weird mascot thingy, and like it's the same thing over and over again. I'm just so extremely tired of it.
This is it. This is the final boss of indie horror. Things have not been looking good for all that have taken the Faz pill all those years ago. Last year, we had to go through Poppy Playtime and the fallout of that game's launch. Last month, we had to go through the most manufactured game of all time with Garten of BanBan. And now, we don't even have people making their own ideas anymore. Now they're just taking everything that was and is trendy, mixing it all into an evil cauldron, and spilling it out for an absurd price tag. At least that's the case for a new game I found called Spectator.
What do these clips have in common? Well, for starters, it seems forced, or at least too harsh for what they're talking about. I understand that being harsh or brutally honest is a good way to get your point across. I've done that too, but gosh, to this extent? For example, in the first clip, Lanza is talking about how this might be the end of good indie horror games, and they're basing that off of Garten of BanBan and Poppy Playtime. Oh my god, guys, this is not the end of indie horror. You have to be kidding me. Are people really saying this? Have you ever watched the 3 Scary Games video by Markiplier? There are almost 100 3 Scary Games videos, and almost all of them show amazingly well made and unique indie horror games made by genuine developers. Almost 100 of those videos. That means that there are a little less than 300 indie horror games that aren't a Poppy Playtime or a Garden of BanBan. I mean, yeah, not all of these were good, some were bad.
Thanks. Oh shit. They're coming.
What?
You better watch out with those pizzas or
What do
they'll
you-
find you.
What do you mean? What does that even mean? What does that even...
Some were outstanding, but of those 300, at least 3% of them were generic indie horror games. I just don't get the thought process of looking at a genre, let's say comedy, the comedy genre, and judging whether it's good or bad or dying based off of 3 or hell, even 5 shows. Now, onto the second clip, Foco goes on about how repetitive and unoriginal horror content is and how trash everything is and that they can't be bothered to play these games. They briefly mentioned that, of course, there are good indie horror games, but them saying that is superseded by how they portrayed mascot horror and how they summed it all up in this generalization, that all these games are the same and they all suck now because they follow the same shtick. That isn't entirely wrong. There are a bunch of games, big or small, that attempt what FNAF or Poppy Playtime did, and there are bad indie horror titles. There's probably countless games that tried what Spectator did, but even worse. None of those games are being talked about, mainly because they go unseen, and that's a good thing. That's what we want. So why when something blows up, then do we decide to make videos on it? Spreading this idea realistically is what makes these so hated games. If Poppy Playtime and indie horror weren't so problematic right now, I doubt games like Garten of BanBan or Spectator would even exist. That's what I mean by how the media feeds off of pessimism. We're only gonna see more of these games pop up now that the indie horror genre has become a relatively trending topic that's unfairly been shoved under a negative spotlight. So in a way, these creators kind of fucked us up. Spreading such a negative, depressing idea about indie horror is only gonna spread further, and gradually, the genre might actually end up being filled to the brim with shady companies that want to cash in on the extremely popular subject. So my advice to all these creators, big and small, please stop making these videos portraying indie or mascot horror in such a bad light. You're really only making it worse for everyone, and obviously, if another shitty game clone pops up, just put your content creating brain aside and just forget it. Still in all, I think it's time to move on from this awful and awfully stupid dumb mindset. Indie/mascot horror is not dying, and neither is it getting worse. Yeah, a few shitty clone games got popular, but that doesn't take away from the fact that there are hundreds of really fun and well-made indie games that you can play for a low price or even free. And I think instead of spending your money on something like Spectator just to hate it, spend a few bucks or none at all on games that are actually good and prove that the indie horror genre is not dying.